The next system that we're covering in systemic anatomy and physiology is the respiratory system. The respiratory system is made up of the nose, the mouth, the pharynx and larynx, trachea, bronchi, and lungs. The respiratory system contributes to homeostasis by providing the exchange of gases, specifically oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the atmosphere, blood, and tissue cells. The respiratory system also contributes to homeostasis by maintaining the pH of body fluids. So 5 learning objectives to cover for the anatomy of the respiratory system. First, to discuss the structure and the general functions of the respiratory system. To describe the structures that make up the conducting zone and then the respiratory zone. To describe the pleura, which are the membranes that surround the lungs. And finally, to describe the blood supply of the lungs, remembering that one of the primary functions of the respiratory system is to participate in gas exchange between the environment and our blood and body tissues. So getting started on learning objective number 1, to describe the structure and function of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system consists of the nose, the pharynx, which is also known as the throat, the larynx, which is also known as the voice box, the trachea, also known as the windpipe, the bronchi, which we have a left and a right main bronchus, and the lungs. As I briefly mentioned, those structures work together to maintain homeostasis by participating in gas exchange, where we inspire or breathe in air that's rich in oxygen and deliver it to the cells of the body. We then expire air, which contains carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that's produced when we convert the nutrients that we ingest and absorb in our gastrointestinal tract and turn them into ATP. The respiratory system also functions to help regulate blood pH, or the acidity or the number of hydrogen ions in the blood. The respiratory system also contains receptors for smell in the nose. It filters air through our mucous membranes and hairs that we also find in our nose. We produce sound as air moves past our voice box or our larynx. And we also secrete small amounts of water and heat in our breath as we breathe out. Now, when we look at the respiratory system as a whole and all of the structures that make up the respiratory system, we can classify these in 2 ways. Structurally, based on simply the location of each of the structures or the organs, or functionally based on what each of these structures does. Considering the structural classification first, and we have the upper respiratory tract and the lower respiratory tract. Our upper respiratory tract contains our nose and our nasal cavity, our mouth and our pharynx. So we have our nose and nasal cavity, our mouth, and then our pharynx, so the throat. Our lower respiratory tract contains our larynx or our voice box, our trachea, our bronchi, and our lungs. So remember, our larynx is this cartilage-lined tube here. Our trachea is our windpipe. Our bronchi are the 2 pipes that then go into the lungs, and then these here and here are the lungs themselves. So very clearly divided into the upper and the lower respiratory tracts. Now, you may have heard of upper and lower respiratory tracts when you've been ill and you've seen the doctor. An upper respiratory tract infection affects obviously the upper part of your respiratory system. So think like your sinuses, your throat. And our upper respiratory tract infections typically include symptoms like a runny nose, a sore throat when it's hard to swallow, and having a bit of a cough. A lower respiratory tract infection is usually much more serious and it affects the lungs themselves. So symptoms include having a shortness of breath, feeling weak, often have a fever, quite a wet cough, and fatigue. The lower respiratory tract infections can also develop into conditions like bronchitis and pneumonia. Functionally, the respiratory system also consists of 2 parts. We have the conducting zone, which is a series of interconnecting cavities and tubes that are both outside and within the lungs. These include the nose and the navel cavity, the pharynx and the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and then our terminal bronchioles. The function of the conducting zone is to filter, warm, and moisten air and conduct it or move it into our lungs. The respiratory zone then begins at our respiratory bronchioles, consists of our respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and the alveoli themselves. And this is where gas exchange actually occurs. So the movement of oxygen from our lungs into the blood and carbon dioxide from the blood into our lungs. So that leads quite nicely into our second learning objective, which is to look at the conducting zone in a little bit more detail and describe the structures that make up the conducting zone. Now, I'm not only going to describe the structure, but also the function of these regions, just so that when we come to the physiology of the respiratory system, we can really focus on things like gas exchange and how those gases are transported around our body. But I don't want you to get too caught up on the functions of all of these structures. Most of the functions you would be kind of aware of anyway, or I'm sure you could kind of guess. But if I ask you to describe a function in one of our lab exams, I'm only asking for something really basic. Think passage of air or voice production. I don't want you to go into too much detail. So the conducting zone starts at the nose. The nose is the entrance to the respiratory system, and it consists of a visible external portion, which we call the nose, and then an internal portion, which sits inside the skull, and that we call the nasal cavity. Our nose is made up of bone and hyaline cartilage. It's covered by muscle and skin, and on the inside, it's lined by a mucous membrane. The openings in your nose are called your nostrils, or also your nares, so N-A-R-E-S. The nasal septum is the cartilage that separates each of your nostrils. Within the nasal cavity, this top portion up here is what we consider the olfactory region. This is where we find the receptors for smell. The lower portion of the nasal cavity is considered the respiratory region. The respiratory region is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. What that means is that it's a single layer of cells that looks like it's multiple layers because of how the cells are arranged. The cells are column-shaped and they have cilia. So cilia are kind of like microvilli on the edge of a cell, but instead of acting to increase surface area, these projections actually move quite rhythmically and they help move substances on the surface of these cells. This epithelium also contains many goblet cells. Remembering our goblet cells produce mucus. Inside the nasal cavity, we also have these grooves on the lateral walls of the nose called the conchae. We have a superior, middle, and inferior conchae on each side. These grooves extend into the nasal cavity and they increase the surface area of the mucous membrane. So the air enters into the conducting zone via our nostrils. It passes through those coarse nostril hairs that we have at the opening to our nose. Those hairs will filter out large dust particles. The inhaled air then swirls around in our nasal cavity. It's warmed as it passes by capillaries in that epithelium. Mucus is secreted by the goblet cells, which not only helps moisten the air, but will also trap smaller dust particles. The cilia on the epithelium then move the mucus and any trapped dust particles towards the pharynx or the throat, at which point you can either swallow it or you can spit it out. The nose and the nasal cavity also play a role in modifying the speech vibrations as they pass through the nasal cavity, but we'll speak more about that when we come to the larynx. So a function of the nose and the nasal cavity: to warm, moisten and filter air, to detect olfactory stimuli, and to act as a resonance chamber for speech. The pharynx, which we discussed in detail in the last series of lectures, is a funnel-shaped tube about 13 centimetres long that starts behind the nasal cavity and extends all the way down to just behind the larynx or the voice box. These walls of the pharynx are composed of skeletal muscle, and it's also lined by a mucous membrane. Within the respiratory system, so just thinking about a function of the pharynx for the respiratory system, it serves as a passageway for air. The larynx, which we also briefly mentioned in the gastrointestinal system lectures, you may also know as the voice box. It is a short passage made up mostly of cartilage that connects the bottom of the pharynx with the trachea. So it's like this little section just here. An important structure within the larynx, which we've also mentioned before, is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is this flap of elastic cartilage which covers the trachea while you're swallowing so that food goes down your esophagus and not down into your windpipe. The larynx also helps prevent the entry of foreign substances into the respiratory tract by initiating a coughing reflex when small particles of dust, smoke, food, or even liquids pass into the larynx. The cough will usually expel that foreign substance. Mucus produced by the goblet cells in the lining of the larynx also help trap dust that's not removed in the nasal cavity. Like what happens in the nose, the cilia on the cells which line the upper respiratory tract will move that dust towards the pharynx so that we can swallow it or we can spit it out. The other structure that I would like you to be aware of in the larynx are these folds of the mucous membrane here. We have a superior pair of folds which are called the vestibular or the false vocal cords. These folds don't actually assist in voice production, hence the false vocal cords, but they do help by increasing pressure in the thoracic cavity when you kind of hold your breath to lift something really heavy. The inferior or the lower set of folds in that mucous membrane are called the vocal folds or the true vocal cords, and these are the structures that will help you speak. So taking a closer look at those vocal folds or those true vocal cords, and these are the principal structures of voice production. So if this is an image of our larynx, a view as if you're looking down someone's throat, these parts here and here are our vestibular folds, so those upper folds of the mucous membrane. These white parts here and here are our vocal folds or our true vocal cords. Now looking on this side here, deep to the mucous membrane of those vocal folds are a band of elastic ligaments that are stretched between the cartilages of the larynx. So you can see that here. The white is the cartilage surrounding the larynx. This part is our elastic ligaments. How these ligaments work are kind of like strings on a guitar. So the intrinsic muscles of the larynx attach to both the cartilage and these ligaments. And when they contract, they move the cartilage, which pulls those ligaments really tight. The movement will pull those ligaments closer into the passage of air. So the arrows are going the other way, but that's what happens when they relax. When they contract, they'll move closer into the middle, so where the air goes past. As the air moves from your lungs out towards your mouth, these folds and these ligaments will vibrate and they produce sound waves in the pharynx, the nose, and the mouth. The variation in pitch of our voices is dependent on the tension or how tightly these vocal cords or these ligaments are pulled. And the greater the pressure of air coming from your lungs out into your mouth, the louder the sound produced by those vibrating folds. Now, I said that the pharynx, the nose, and the mouth act as what we call a resonance chamber. This simply means that these regions are chambers or cavities which allow sound, the vibrations caused by sound, to echo and build up. So due to the shape of these chambers and how the sound waves move around in these areas, we'll amplify and modify the sound of our voices. The next structure in our conducting zone is the trachea. The trachea is also known as the windpipe, and it's a tubular passageway for air that is about 12 centimetres long, 2.5 centimetres in diameter. It's located anterior to or in front of the esophagus, and it extends from the larynx up here down to the border of about T5, so your fifth thoracic vertebra, where it then divides into a left and right bronchi. So looking on this image here, we have our esophagus, which is posterior, our trachea, which is anterior. The inner layer of the trachea is the mucosa, which is also made up of our pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which remember we talked about before as being a single layer of column-shaped cells that look like they're multiple layers due to how the cells are arranged kind of nice and tightly and a bit overlapping. This mucosa also contains lots of goblet cells which produce mucus, and they provide the same type of protection against dust as the lining of the nasal cavity and the larynx, where the dust is trapped in that mucus and the cilia move it towards the pharynx where you can swallow it or you can spit it out. Now, looking at this view of the trachea here, you can see that this structure is made up of a series of incomplete horizontal C-shaped rings of hyaline cartilage. So this white structure here is cartilage. It doesn't actually go all the way around the trachea. It's incomplete and kind of makes the shape of a C. The open part of the C faces posteriorly to the esophagus. And so this is that when we take a really big mouthful of food, we haven't chewed it very well, it can still make its way through the esophagus down to the stomach, even if it needs to bulge a little bit into the trachea. If that was a complete ring of cartilage, we'd often get food stuck in the trachea as it hits each of those rings of cartilage. The rigid structure of the trachea, being mainly made up of cartilage, is really important. It will hold the trachea open and stop it from collapsing when we breathe inward during exhalation. Obviously, the function of the trachea is that it's a passageway for air. Continuing down towards the lungs, I mentioned that at the level of T5, or the fifth thoracic vertebra, that the trachea splits into a right main or primary bronchus, which goes into the right lung, and then a left main or primary bronchus that goes into the left lung. So bronchus is the singular, bronchi is the plural. The point at which the trachea splits into these two main bronchi is called the carina, so C-A-R-I-N-A. And this part is actually the most sensitive part of the respiratory system for triggering a cough reflex. So if anything manages to get down to the carina, it will stimulate quite an intense coughing fit. Like the trachea, the bronchi are made up of incomplete rings of cartilage and lined by that pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. Upon entering the lung, so if this is our main or primary bronchus here, the bronchi will then divide again. So we've got 1, 2, 3 sections here into what we call our lobar or our secondary bronchus. The lobar or secondary bronchi go into each of the lobes of the lungs. So our right lung has 3 lobes, our left lung has 2. The bronchi then divide again, so you can see that division on the outskirts here and here. These are now our segmental or our tertiary bronchus. These go into the different segments of the lungs. Our segmental or our tertiary bronchi will then in turn repeatedly branch into smaller and smaller tubes until we reach our bronchioles, our terminal bronchioles, which we will look at on the next slide. The extensive branching from the trachea down to our terminal bronchiole is what we refer to as the bronchial tree. So to recap that information, we have our trachea, splits into our main or primary bronchus, our lobar or secondary bronchus, and then our segmental or tertiary bronchus. The division of the tubes we then call our bronchioles, and I am going to make this distinction in your lab exams. So if I'm talking about one of these first three splits, it's a bronchus or a bronchi. Any division from there on is now a bronchiole. We split about 23 times till we reach our terminal bronchiole, which is the last structure in our conducting zone. Now, as the branching becomes more extensive in this bronchial tree, there are several structural changes that occur. The epithelium becomes a simple cuboidal epithelium or a single layer of cube-shaped cells. There are fewer and then no goblet cells. The amount of cartilage decreases as the number of divisions or splits increases. With the less cartilage that we have more smooth muscle. In our smaller bronchioles that actually have no cartilage and more smooth muscle, spasms of these smooth muscle can actually close off the airways, and this is what happens during an asthma attack. Going the other way during exercise or other scenarios that activate our sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal medulla will release that epinephrine and the norepinephrine, and that actually acts to relax the smooth muscle in the bronchioles and dilate the airways so that we can have maximum gas exchange. So we've done all of that splitting and division of the bronchial tree. We've come down to our final division, the final structure in our conducting zone, which we call our terminal bronchioles, terminal meaning last. If I were to ask you to identify the terminal bronchioles on an image, you would be looking for this tube here, which is the last structure before we enter the respiratory zones, which signify the start of the respiratory bronchioles, which signify the start of the respiratory zone. So our terminal bronchioles, passageway for air. So before we move on to our respiratory zone, just recapping that conducting zone, we have our nasal cavity in our nose, our pharynx, our larynx, our trachea. It splits at the carina into our main or our primary bronchi, our lobar and secondary bronchi, and then our segmental or tertiary bronchi. From there, we have roughly 23 divisions of those tubes into our bronchioles. The final structure in our conducting zone is our terminal bronchioles. So looking at that on an image, we have our nose and then internally the nasal cavity, the pharynx being our throat, the larynx being the cartilage area near our voice box, our trachea, the main bronchi, the lobar bronchi, and then the segmental or tertiary bronchi. The rest of the divisions are our bronchioles. That very last division before we go into our respiratory zone is our terminal bronchioles. So from the terminal bronchioles, the air that we breathe in now travels to our respiratory zone. And the distinction between our conducting and our respiratory zone being that the conducting zone only conducts the air, so it's only a passageway for the air to move through, whereas the structures in the respiratory zone can participate in gas exchange. So the respiratory zone begins at the respiratory bronchioles, As the respiratory bronchioles penetrate more deeply into the lungs, the epithelial changes from simple cuboidal into simple squamous. Respiratory bronchioles, in turn, subdivide into between 2 and 11 alveoli ducts. So an alveoli duct are these parts here. They're also made up of simple squamous epithelium. And around the edge of our alveoli ducts are alveolar sacs. So our alveoli sacs are made up of a collection of alveoli which open up into one alveoli duct. So a little bit confusing. So we had our terminal bronchioles, which was the final stage of our conducting zone, coming into our respiratory bronchioles. They then open up into our alveoli ducts. Each alveoli duct kind of has like this bunch of grapes, which we call an alveoli sac. Each individual grape is then the alveoli. Each of those alveoli open up into one common area, which then goes into that alveoli duct. Now, our alveoli are the circle-shaped pouches. They're lined by simple squamous epithelium, and they're supported by a very thin elastic basement membrane. The significance of this type of epithelia is that it is a single layer of very thin cells that selected substances or gases can easily diffuse through. So while we're on the topic of talking about the epithelia, I just wanted to show you this slide. I won't read it out to you. You can have a look at it in your own time. But I just want you to have a little bit of a think about how the epithelium changes as we move down the respiratory tract and the reason for which it changes. So for example, if we start up the top, kind of up in our nasal cavity and in our pharynx, we have that pseudostratified columnar epithelium with lots of goblet cells. So you can see it is actually one layer of cells, but they're kind of arranged in a bit of a strange order. We have the column shapes, we have the cilia on the outside, and we have lots of goblet cells which produce mucus. Now, the mucus produced by the goblet cells traps the dust in the air. The cilia allow that trapped dust to move towards the pharynx so we can swallow it or we can spit it out. So you can quite clearly see the functions of those different structures there. If we move down further in the respiratory zone, you can see that those cells are getting thinner and thinner until we get down into our alveoli, and you can see that it's a very thin single layer of cells. Why that's important is because, as I mentioned, these areas participate in gas exchange. So we're having oxygen go from the alveoli into the blood, and then carbon dioxide go from the blood into the alveoli. And we want to make this process as easy and simple as possible. So this nice thin barrier allows us to do that. But back to our alveoli, and the walls of the alveoli consist of two types of alveoli epithelial cells. We have the more numerous type 1 alveolar cells, which are simple squamous epithelial cells that we just talked about, that form a nearly continuous lining of the alveoli wall. And then we have our type 2 alveolar cells, sometimes also called septal cells, which are fewer in number, and they're found in between the type 1 cells. So these purple cells here that pretty much go all the way around that alveoli are our type 1 cells. These rounder blue cells are our type 2 alveolar cells. Now, the type 1 cells are the main sites for gas exchange. Our type 2 cells, which, as I said, are more round or cuboidal in shape, they also have macrovilli on the surfaces. They secrete an alveoli fluid, which keeps the surface between the cells and the air moist. Included in this alveoli fluid that these type 2 cells secretes is surfactant. Surfactant is a mixture of phospholipids and lipoproteins. Surfactant lowers the surface tension of our alveoli fluid, which reduces the tendency of the alveoli to collapse and stick together and maintain their open structure. So in babies, an adequate amount of surfactant is not produced until about 35 weeks. So babies born prior to this gestation often have difficulties breathing, where this alveoli wall will collapse in when you breathe out. It will kind of stick together. And so then a significant effort is required to kind of breathe in really hardly to reopen that alveoli and allow the gas exchange to occur. So the fluid secreted by this type 2 alveoli cell reduces the surface tension, which kind of helps keep these alveoli open. Now, also associated with the alveoli wall are our alveoli macrophages. These are simply phagocytes that remove any fine dust particles that have made their way into the alveoli, as well as any other debris that we find in this region. So just putting that in writing for you in case you didn't take notes, we have our type 1 alveoli cells, which is the principal site of gas exchange. So gas can easily diffuse through these cells because they're that simple one thin layer of epithelia. We have our type 2 alveolar cells, which produce alveoli fluid, which contains surfactant, which reduces surface tension and prevents the alveoli from collapsing after each exhalation. And then our alveoli macrophages, which are the phagocytes which consume any dust or debris that is found within the alveoli. So we don't try and move that up to the pharynx to spit out, we just consume it within the alveoli itself. So moving on to learning objective 4, and that is to describe the pleura of the lungs. But to talk about the pleura, or the membranes surrounding the lungs, we need to talk a little bit about the lungs themselves. So the lungs are paired organs which sit within the thoracic cavity. The lungs extend from the diaphragm, which is the muscle that sits underneath the ribs like this, to just above our clavicles. So they actually sit up quite high. The lungs lie gently against the ribs, both on the anterior and the posterior surface. And on the medial, or the middle side of each lung, is a region called the hilum, through which the main bronchi, so the bronchi is this part here, our pulmonary blood vessels, so our pulmonary arteries and our pulmonary veins, lymphatic vessels, and nerves will enter and exit. Medially, on the left lung, also contains a small indent. This is called the cardiac notch. And this is where the apex, or the pointy part of the heart, lies. Due to the space that's occupied by the heart, so the indent of the cardiac notch, the left lung is about 10% smaller than the right lung. Now, surrounding and protecting each lung is a double-layered serous membrane called the pleural membranes, or the pleura. The superficial layer, so the layer more on the outside, is called our parietal pleura. This lines the wall of the thoracic cavity, so kind of lining the inside of the ribs. The deeper or more inner layer is called the visceral pleura, and this covers the lungs themselves. Between that parietal and that visceral pleura is a small space called the pleural cavity. Here it's just referred to as the pleural space. And this space contains a small amount of lubricating fluid that's actually secreted by the pleura themselves. This fluid reduces the friction between the membranes, so when you're breathing in and breathing out, they can slide over one another really easily. This fluid also causes those two membranes to stick together, which is a fact that will become really important when we talk about the mechanisms or the steps involved in breathing in and breathing out. It's also important to know that we have separate pleural cavities. So our left and our right lung are completely separated from one another. This is important just in case you have damage. Say you've got a puncture in one of your lungs and it deflates. The other lung will remain completely functioning. So the function of our pleura is to surround and protect our lungs. It secretes a fluid which reduces the friction between those two layers when we breathe in and we breathe out. And it also helps stick those two pleura together. So it sticks basically the lungs to our ribs. And lastly, for the anatomy of the respiratory system, we have learning objective number 5, which is to describe the blood supply of the lungs. So remembering back to the start of this lecture, and one of the major functions of the respiratory system is gas exchange, where we take fresh inhaled air. The oxygen in the air diffuses across the membrane of the alveoli and into the bloodstream, where it's taken to the cells of the body. At the cells, the oxygen diffuses into the cell and carbon dioxide diffuses out. That carbon dioxide goes into the blood, back to the lungs. It diffuses into the alveoli, and we breathe that carbon dioxide out. So it's really, really important that our lungs are well supplied by the cardiovascular system. So our lungs receive blood via 2 sets of arteries, pulmonary arteries and bronchial arteries. Looking at pulmonary circulation to begin with, and deoxygenated blood, so blood that doesn't have much oxygen in it, passes through the pulmonary trunk. So our pulmonary trunk is this common trunk here, which then divides into a left and a right pulmonary artery. The left pulmonary artery will enter the left lung, our right pulmonary artery will enter the right lung. The blood moves down through the lungs into the capillaries that surround the alveoli. Oxygen diffuses into the bloodstream, and the oxygenated blood returns to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins. So we have 2 right pulmonary veins and 2 left pulmonary veins. These then drain into the left atrium of the heart. So the left atrium of the heart is this top chamber here, and we'll look at this when we look at the cardiovascular system. It moves into our left ventricle, which is this chamber underneath the atrium, then into our aorta, so it can travel around the body to bring that fresh oxygen to all our body cells. So don't worry too much about this exact pathway. We're going to cover this again when we look at the cardiovascular system, but we have deoxygenated blood in the right side of our heart that exits the heart through the pulmonary trunk, splits into our right and our left pulmonary arteries. That will then go into the lungs, become oxygenated through the capillaries that surround the alveoli. It will return to the heart through these reds indicating the oxygen content of the blood, through our right pulmonary veins and our left pulmonary veins. Those veins both enter into our left atrium, moves down into our left ventricle. This goes up and out the aorta and then back to the rest of the body to spread around that oxygenated blood. Now, one thing I did want you to be aware of here is that typically arteries carry oxygenated blood and veins carry deoxygenated blood. The only exception to this are our pulmonary arteries and veins, where our pulmonary arteries actually carry the deoxygenated blood and the pulmonary veins carry the oxygenated blood. This is the only exception. This is also important to remember if you're ever asked to describe the difference between an artery and a vein. You must say that our arteries carry blood away from the heart, because it's not always that they carry oxygenated blood, as we can see here, and our veins carry blood back towards the heart. Moving on to the bronchial arteries and veins, and these are simply the blood vessels that supply the lungs themselves. So mainly the smooth muscle in the walls of the bronchi and the bronchioles. So the bronchial arteries branch off that aorta. So after the blood has become oxygenated through the gas exchange in the alveoli, it goes into the aorta, and then we have our bronchial arteries branch off this aorta. The deoxygenated blood returns to the heart mostly via those pulmonary veins. Some blood drains into our bronchial veins and then returns to the heart via the superior vena cava. The bronchial veins and arteries only carry about 1% of the total blood flow in the lungs, so it's not the primary circulation of blood in the lungs, but it is just important to remember that the lungs themselves actually need blood to function. Connections do exist between the branches of the bronchial arteries and the branches of the pulmonary arteries. However, most of the blood, as I said, returns to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Some blood drains into the bronchial veins and then return to the heart via that vena cava. So a recap of the blood supply to the lungs, knowing that we will go over this again when we come to the cardiovascular system. So we have deoxygenated blood passes through that pulmonary trunk into our left and right pulmonary arteries. These arteries then enter the lungs. Blood becomes oxygenated following gas exchange in the alveoli. The oxygenated blood returns to the heart via our 4 pulmonary veins. It empties into the left atrium, moves to the left ventricle, is pumped out of the heart through the aorta and goes around the body. And that brings us to the end of the anatomy of the respiratory system. In the next lecture, we will cover the mechanics of breathing, the specifics of gas exchange, and how carbon dioxide and oxygen travel around the body. Thank you for listening, and you will hear me in the physiology of the respiratory system.